The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of Riverside Manor Estate, where my sister Victoria was about to marry into Portland's elite. 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits filled the grand ballroom, their champagne glasses catching the golden light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. I stood near the back in my simple black dress from Target, watching as Victoria prepared to deliver what she'd promised would be her most meaningful speech yet. What she didn't know was that every flower arrangement, every piece of silverware, every thread of silk draping these walls belonged to me. The venue manager would be making an announcement soon that would change everything, but for now, I was just Maya, the disappointment, playing my part perfectly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Pacific Northwest's most exclusive wedding venue hummed with the energy of Portland's social elite. Riverside Manor Estate perched majestically on the bluffs above the Willamette River, its Victorian architecture commanding respect from anyone who approached its wrought iron gates. Tonight, the estate's grand ballroom buzzed with 300 of the city's most influential residents, all gathered to witness my sister Victoria's marriage to Marcus Hamilton, heir to the Hamilton shipping fortune. The guest list read like a who's who of Portland society, filled with tech executives, real estate moguls, and old money families whose names graced buildings throughout the city. I smoothed down my simple black dress, purchased from Target 3 weeks ago, when Victoria reminded me that this was a formal affair, and I needed to dress appropriately. The fabric felt cheap against my skin compared to the silk and satin surrounding me, but it served its purpose. The other guests saw exactly what they expected to see when they looked at me, Maya Johnson, the struggling younger sister who never quite measured up to Victoria's standards. Their glances lingered just long enough to confirm their assumptions before moving on to more interesting conversation partners. Uncle Tom adjusted his bow tie as he whispered something to Aunt Helen behind his champagne flute. She nodded knowingly, shooting me a look that managed to convey both pity and disappointment in a single expression. Cousin Jessica, resplendent in her emerald green designer gown, offered me a smile that didn't reach her eyes before turning back to her conversation with Portland's deputy mayor. These family gatherings had become exercises in social navigation, where I'd learned to deflect questions about my career with vague mentions of event planning freelance work. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were celebrating in a venue where I'd spent countless hours over the past 5 years, though none of them knew that. To them, Riverside Manor Estate was simply where important events happened, a symbol of the kind of success they all aspired to maintain. The venue's reputation for hosting Portland's most exclusive celebrations had made it nearly impossible to book, with waiting lists stretching years in advance. Victoria had mentioned multiple times how lucky she felt to secure a date here, especially on such short notice after her original venue fell through. My phone buzzed against my clutch, a subtle vibration that made my heart race slightly. David Miller, the venue manager, was texting updates about the evening's schedule. In exactly 47 minutes, he would be making an announcement that would shift the entire dynamic of this celebration. For now, though, I was content to play the role everyone expected, the family member who didn't quite belong in these elegant surroundings. Victoria stood at the head table, her custom Vera Wang gown cascading around her like liquid moonlight. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully orchestrated, from her professionally styled hair to the heirloom diamond necklace that had belonged to our grandmother. She embodied everything our parents had dreamed their daughters would become, poised and polished, married to a man whose family tree included railroad barons and lumber magnates. Marcus Hamilton sat beside her, his presence commanding attention even while seated, the kind of man who'd never questioned his place in the world because that place had been secured before his birth. The Hamilton family occupied the entire front row, their names associated with half the cultural institutions in Portland. Marcus's mother, Eleanor Hamilton, wore pearls that probably cost more than most people's cars, while his father discussed venture capital opportunities with the mayor. This was the world Victoria had always belonged to, the world she'd been preparing for since childhood, with cotillion classes and charity galas. My parents, Robert and Patricia Johnson, beamed with pride from their seats at the family table. Dad had worn his best suit, the one he'd purchased for his promotion to senior partner at his accounting firm 3 years ago. Mom's dress was elegant but clearly off the rack, though she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd worked hard to provide her daughters with opportunities she'd never had. They'd sacrificed considerably to ensure Victoria could attend the private schools and summer programs that had introduced her to families like the Hamiltons. The sacrifices they'd made for my education had yielded different results. While Victoria had used her advantages to climb social ladders and secure her position among Portland's elite, I'd taken a more unconventional path. My parents still introduced me as their daughter who was finding her way, a kind euphemism for someone who hadn't lived up to expectations. They loved me, but I could see the questions in their eyes whenever other parents discussed their children's achievements. Victoria's college roommate, Amanda Wells, caught my eye from across the room and offered a wave that felt more obligatory than genuine. Amanda worked for a prestigious marketing firm downtown, and had always treated me with the kind of polite condescension reserved for family members of friends. Her husband owned a successful restaurant group, and they lived in a Pearl District loft that had been featured in Architectural Digest. She represented the kind of success story that made sense to people, measurable and visible. The conversations around me flowed like expensive wine, smooth and intoxicating to those who belonged in these circles. I heard discussions about vacation homes and Bend children's acceptances to Ivy League schools, and investment opportunities that required minimum commitments most people would never see in their lifetimes. These were the conversations that had shaped my sister's worldview, the background music of a life lived among Portland's most privileged residents. My phone buzzed again, another update from David about the evening's timeline. The wedding photographer moved through the crowd like a dancer, capturing moments of joy and celebration that would become treasured memories for Victoria and Marcus. What he couldn't capture was the undercurrent of judgment that followed me through the room, the subtle ways people positioned themselves to exclude me from their conversations without appearing rude. The venue itself seemed to mock my presence among these guests. Riverside Manor Estate's grand ballroom featured soaring ceilings supported by hand-carved columns, crystal chandeliers that had been imported from France, and windows that offered breathtaking views of the river and city lights beyond. The space had hosted presidential fundraisers, corporate galas that raised millions for charity, and wedding receptions for families whose names appeared on museum donor walls throughout the Pacific Northwest. Every detail of the evening had been carefully coordinated to reflect the Hamilton family's status and Victoria's impeccable taste. The floral arrangements alone had cost more than many people earned in months, featuring rare orchids and roses flown in from specialized growers across the country. The catering showcased the finest Pacific.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Northwest ingredients, prepared by a team of chefs whose restaurants had earned James Beard nominations. I checked the time on my phone once more, noting how the minutes seemed to crawl by as I waited for the moment that would change everything. In less than an hour, everyone in this room would understand that appearances could be deceiving, that success didn't always announce itself with designer labels and prestigious addresses. For now, though, I was content to let them maintain their assumptions about who belonged in spaces like this and who didn't. The sound of silverware against crystal began to fill the air as guests prepared for the toasts that would mark the evening's emotional climax. Victoria stood gracefully, her champagne flute catching the light as she prepared to address the crowd. This was her moment to shine, to demonstrate the poise and eloquence that had always made her the family favorite. What she didn't realize was that her speech about belonging and success was about to be interrupted by a revelation that would reframe everything she thought she knew about her younger sister's place in the world. Part 2. Character positioning. The whispers had started the moment I'd walked through Riverside Manor's grand entrance. Aunt Helen's eyebrows had risen in that particular way that suggested surprise mixed with mild disapproval, while Uncle Tom had given me the kind of once-over that made it clear he was cataloging every detail of my appearance for future discussion. The contrast between my Target dress and the sea of designer gowns couldn't have been more obvious if I'd worn a neon sign announcing my budget constraints. Victoria's friends from her sorority days at the University of Oregon clustered near the champagne fountain, their conversation punctuated by perfectly timed laughter and the kind of air kisses that left lipstick marks on cheeks. I recognized most of them from Victoria's social media posts, women who'd married well and maintained the kind of lifestyle that required personal trainers, weekly salon appointments, and vacation homes in Sun Valley. They'd glanced in my direction when I'd arrived, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to something approaching pity when they realized who I was. Amanda Wells had been particularly obvious in her assessment, her gaze traveling from my drugstore makeup to my sensible flats with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for home inspections. She'd whispered something to the woman beside her, a brunette whose husband owned several successful tech startups, and both had nodded with the satisfaction of people confirming their assumptions about social hierarchies. Their world operated on unspoken rules about brands, connections, and the subtle signals that separated insiders from everyone else. The Hamilton family's friends represented old Portland money, the kind of wealth that had been accumulated over generations and maintained through careful marriages and strategic investments. They spoke in the measured tones of people who'd never had to raise their voices to command attention, their conversations flowing between topics like private school tuition rates, charitable board positions, and the challenges of finding reliable staff for their various properties. These were families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, whose influence shaped the city's cultural and economic landscape. My parents had positioned themselves strategically near the family table, close enough to the action to feel included but far enough from the Hamilton contingent to avoid uncomfortable conversations about their own more modest circumstances. Dad's accounting firm served many successful clients, but he'd never achieved the kind of wealth that would make him appear to the shipping magnates and real estate developers filling the ballroom. Mom had spent weeks shopping for the perfect dress, finally settling on something elegant but clearly not custom-made, a choice that placed her firmly in the category of guests, rather than true members of this social circle. The young professionals in attendance represented Portland's rising elite tech executives and entrepreneurs who'd built fortunes in the digital economy but still sought acceptance from established families like the Hamiltons. They'd achieved financial success quickly but lacked the generational connections that would grant them automatic entry into the city's most exclusive circles. Their conversations centered around IPOs, startup valuations, and the kind of networking opportunities that might elevate their social status to match their bank balances. I'd become skilled at reading these social dynamics over the years, understanding how people position themselves relative to perceived status and influence. The seating arrangements alone told a story about relationships and hierarchies, with the most important guests clustered near the head table, while others were relegated to positions that reflected their place in the Hamilton family's social universe. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to reinforce the established order, from the calligraphy on the place cards to the carefully curated guest list. The venue staff moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, their black uniforms creating a stark contrast to the colorful formal wear of the guests. They'd been trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to maintain an invisible presence, while ensuring every aspect of the evening proceeded flawlessly. The level of service at Riverside Manor Estate was legendary among Portland's social elite, one of the reasons the venue commanded premium prices and maintained waiting lists that stretched for years. Marcus Hamilton's groomsmen represented the kind of social circle that forms around inherited privilege, men who'd attended the same prep schools and Ivy League universities, who summered in the Hamptons and maintained memberships at exclusive clubs across the country. Their conversation topics ranged from yacht purchases to investment strategies, from private golf courses to the challenges of managing trust funds. They embodied the effortless confidence that comes from never having to prove their worth or justify their place in elite circles. The older generation of guests moved through the ballroom with the measured pace of people accustomed to being the center of attention at social gatherings. These were Portland's power brokers, individuals whose decisions shaped everything from city planning to cultural programming. They'd known each other for decades, their relationships forged through business partnerships, charitable endeavors, and the kind of social connections that created an insular community within the larger city. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of conversations, close enough to appear engaged but positioned where I could observe without drawing unwanted attention to my presence. This vantage point had taught me to recognize the subtle signals that governed these interactions, the way people adjusted their posture when someone more important entered their conversation circle, the particular tone reserved for discussing those who didn't quite measure up to social expectations. The photography throughout the evening captured moments of joy and celebration, but also documented the careful choreography of social positioning that defined events like this. Every group photo reinforced existing hierarchies, with the most prominent families positioned centrally while others arranged themselves according to their perceived importance. The photographer understood these dynamics instinctively, his camera capturing not just memories but a visual record of Portland's social structure. Victoria's transformation over the years had been remarkable to witness, her evolution from the academically focused teenager I'd grown up with into someone who navigated these social complexities with apparent ease. She'd learned to speak the language of this world fluently, her conversations peppered with references to charity galas, country club events, and the kind of social obligations that filled the calendars of Portland's elite families. Her engagement to Marcus represented the culmination of years spent cultivating relationships and positioning herself within the right social circles. The conversations swirling around me created a soundtrack of privilege, filled with casual mentions of European vacations, private school acceptances, and business deals worth millions of dollars. These topics were discussed with the same ease most people reserved for commenting on the weather, reflecting a world where such advantages were simply assumed rather than celebrated. The guests spoke of their accomplishments and acquisitions with practiced modesty, a performance designed to acknowledge their success while appearing appropriately humble. My own presence in this environment felt increasingly surreal as the evening progressed, my role as Victoria's younger sister granting me access to a world where I was clearly perceived as not belonging. The polite smiles and brief conversations I'd experienced throughout the cocktail hour carried undertones of curiosity about how someone like me had ended up among Portland's most privileged residents. Their questions about my work were asked with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for discussing someone's recovery from illness. Part 3. Tension Building. The grandfather clock in the corner of Riverside Manor's ballroom chimed 8:30, its deep resonance cutting through the elegant chatter and clinking of crystal. My phone vibrated against my palm where I held it discreetly beneath the white linen tablecloth, a message from David Miller confirming that everything was proceeding according to schedule. In exactly 45 minutes, he would make the announcement that would shatter every assumption the 300 guests had formed about my place in their world. Until then, I had to endure whatever Victoria had planned for her maid of honor speech. The anticipation in the room was palpable, the kind of electric energy that builds when people sense they're about to witness something memorable. Victoria had been dropping hints for weeks about her speech, promising that it would be deeply personal and meaningful, the kind of toast that would be remembered long after the last guest had departed. She'd practiced in front of mirrors and rehearsed key phrases during our family dinners, her excitement building as she prepared to share what she called her most important thoughts about success, family, and the choices that define our lives. I adjusted my position in the uncomfortable folding chair, its metal frame digging into my back as I maintained the appearance of eager anticipation. The family table had been positioned strategically close to the head table, ensuring that every reaction would be visible to the wedding photographer and the guests scattered throughout the ballroom. My parents sat to my left, their faces glowing with pride as they prepared to hear their eldest daughter share her wisdom with Portland's social elite. The timeline David had shared with me earlier indicated that the evening's formal program would begin shortly, starting with Victoria's toast and followed by remarks from Marcus's father about the joining of two distinguished families. The wedding planner, a woman whose client list included tech billionaires and entertainment industry executives, moved through the crowd with the precision of a military commander, ensuring that every detail proceeded according to the carefully choreographed schedule that had taken months to perfect. My fingers traced the edge of my phone case, a nervous habit I'd developed during the 5 years of maintaining this elaborate deception. The device contained messages from business partners across the Pacific Northwest, updates on quarterly earnings reports, and confirmation of deals worth millions of dollars. To everyone around me, though, it was simply the phone of someone who couldn't afford the latest model, another small detail that reinforced their assumptions about my financial circumstances. The weight of carrying this secret had grown heavier with each family gathering, each social event where I'd been forced to play the role of the underachieving younger sister. There had been moments when I'd been tempted to reveal the truth, particularly during conversations where relatives offered unsolicited advice about my career or suggested connections that might help me find more stable employment. The irony of receiving networking tips from people whose own businesses depended on venues I owned had required considerable self-control to navigate gracefully. Victoria's excitement about her speech had been building for weeks, her conversations filled with references to the important lessons she wanted to share, and the impact she hoped her words would have on the gathered guests. She'd mentioned several times that she planned to use my struggles as an example of what could happen when someone didn't make practical choices, a cautionary tale that would highlight the wisdom of her own more traditional path to success. The venue's acoustic design ensured that every word would carry clearly to the farthest corners of the ballroom, a feature that had made Riverside Manor Estate particularly popular for events where speeches played a central role. The same technology that would amplify Victoria's voice would also broadcast David's announcement when the moment arrived, ensuring that no guest would miss the revelation that would transform their understanding of the evening's dynamics. I could see Amanda Wells positioning herself near the edge of the dance floor, her phone ready to capture what she clearly anticipated would be a memorable moment. Social media had become an integral part of events like this, with guests competing to share the most striking images and quotes from the celebration. Victoria's speech would undoubtedly generate significant online engagement, though probably not in the way she was expecting. The Hamilton family members had arranged themselves strategically throughout the ballroom, their positions chosen to maximize their visibility during the formal portions of the evening. Marcus's mother wore an expression of benevolent interest, the kind of smile that suggested she was prepared to be charmed by her new daughter-in-law's eloquence. His father consulted his vintage Rolex, a gesture that indicated his expectation that the evening's program would proceed efficiently and conclude at an appropriately sophisticated hour. The catering staff had begun clearing the dessert plates, their movements synchronized with military precision as they prepared the space for the toasts that would mark the evening's emotional climax. The timing of their service had been carefully coordinated with the speech schedule, ensuring that guests would have their full attention available for Victoria's remarks rather than being distracted by ongoing meal service. My heart rate had been steadily increasing as the moment approached, not from nervousness about Victoria's speech, but from anticipation of what would follow. The careful planning that had gone into this evening extended far beyond the wedding itself, encompassing strategies I'd been developing for months to ensure that the revelation of my true circumstances would have maximum impact while maintaining the dignity that had characterized my approach to business throughout my career. The photographer had positioned himself near the head table, his professional equipment ready to capture the expressions and reactions that would define this moment in the Hamilton family's history. His portfolio included images from some of Portland's most significant social events, and he understood the importance of documenting not just the planned moments, but also the spontaneous reactions that often became the most treasured memories. Victoria stood slowly, her movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the ballroom as conversations gradually faded and all eyes turned toward the head table. The crystal chandeliers cast dramatic shadows across her face, highlighting the careful makeup application that had taken her professional team nearly 2 hours to complete. Her Vera Wang gown caught the light magnificently, creating an image of bridal perfection that would anchor the evening's photographic record. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the gentle hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of river traffic beyond the mansion's windows. They'd been present at numerous family gatherings where my career choices had been discussed with varying degrees of concern and disappointment. Their familiarity with these conversations had prepared them to appreciate whatever insights Victoria might share about the importance of making responsible life decisions. "I want to talk specifically about my sister Maya tonight," Victoria said, turning to smile in my direction with an expression of sisterly affection mixed with gentle concern. "Maya's here with us this evening, and I think her journey illustrates some important truths about the choices we make and the consequences that follow. I hope she won't mind me sharing her story, because I believe it contains lessons that could benefit everyone in this room." The 300 guests turned their attention toward me with the synchronized precision of a ballet company, their collective gaze creating a spotlight effect that made the simple black dress I'd chosen seem even more modest in comparison to the designer gowns surrounding me. I maintained a serene expression, the same calm demeanor I'd perfected during years of high-stakes business negotiations, where revealing emotions could cost millions of dollars in leverage. My parents' faces reflected a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, their expressions suggesting they weren't entirely sure what direction Victoria's speech might take. They'd witnessed enough family discussions about my unconventional career path to understand that such conversations rarely portrayed my choices in entirely positive terms. Dad adjusted his tie nervously while Mom reached for her water glass, both of them preparing for whatever insights their eldest daughter might share about their youngest. "Maya has always been creative and ambitious," Victoria continued, her tone suggesting the kind of patient affection typically reserved for discussing beloved but troubled family members. "She's tried her hand at many different ventures over the years, always convinced that the next opportunity would be the one that finally brought her the success she'd been seeking. I've watched her pursue dreams with incredible passion, even when those dreams didn't align with practical realities." The guests nodded knowingly, their expressions reflecting recognition of a familiar story about family members who prioritized passion over practicality. This narrative resonated particularly strongly with the older generation in attendance, people who'd built their fortunes through careful planning and conservative decision-making rather than pursuing risky entrepreneurial ventures. They appreciated Victoria's thoughtful analysis of the differences between romantic idealism and mature pragmatism. Amanda Wells had moved closer to the head table, her phone positioned to capture both Victoria's remarks and my reactions to them. Social media documentation of significant moments had become an expected component of high society events, with guests competing to share the most compelling content from exclusive gatherings. Victoria's speech was clearly developing into the kind of memorable moment that would generate substantial online engagement. Event planning seemed like such a natural fit for Maya's talents, Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the ballroom with increasing confidence. "She has wonderful organizational skills and genuine creativity, qualities that should have translated into business success. But instead of building something stable and sustainable, she chose to remain freelance, taking on small projects that barely covered her living expenses while holding on to dreams of something bigger." The implicit contrast between my modest freelance income and the grandeur of the evening's celebration wasn't lost on the assembled guests. They could see the evidence of Victoria's success surrounding them, from the exclusive venue to the lavish decorations to the carefully curated guest list filled with Portland's most influential residents. My presence in this environment, dressed in obviously affordable clothing and apparently struggling to maintain financial stability, reinforced their assumptions about the differences between practical and impractical approaches to building a career. Marcus's family members exchanged subtle glances that suggested approval of Victoria's analytical approach to discussing family dynamics. The Hamilton tradition emphasized the importance of learning from both positive and negative examples, using family stories to illustrate broader principles about success and responsibility. Victoria's willingness to address these topics publicly demonstrated the kind of maturity and wisdom they valued in their son's choice of spouse. I've tried to help Maya understand the benefits of pursuing more traditional career paths, Victoria explained, her expression conveying genuine concern for my well-being. There are opportunities in established companies, positions that offer health insurance, retirement benefits, and the kind of security that allows people to plan for the future. But Maya has always been convinced that entrepreneurship was her calling, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. The professional event planners and hospitality industry executives in attendance nodded appreciatively at Victoria's comments about traditional career benefits. They understood the challenges facing freelance workers in their industry, the difficulty of maintaining consistent income and building long-term financial security without the support structures provided by established organizations. Victoria's observations aligned with their own professional experiences and reinforced their belief in the wisdom of choosing stability over uncertainty. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers created dramatic lighting effects as Victoria continued her speech, their reflection in the river-facing windows adding visual grandeur to her words. The venue's sophisticated atmosphere reinforced the authority behind her observations, suggesting that someone celebrating in such elegant surroundings clearly understood the principles necessary for achieving genuine success. The contrast between the evening's luxury and my apparent financial struggles made her arguments particularly compelling. What worries me most about Maya's approach is the way it reflects a broader cultural trend toward valuing dreams over reality, Victoria said, her tone becoming more serious as she prepared to deliver what seemed to be the central message of her speech. Young people today are often encouraged to follow their passions without considering practical limitations, to pursue entrepreneurial ventures without understanding the statistical likelihood of failure. Maya's story illustrates what can happen when someone embraces that philosophy without appropriate caution. The guests received this observation with the kind of solemn attention typically reserved for profound insights about contemporary social issues. Victoria had successfully framed my situation as representative of broader generational challenges, transforming her personal observations into commentary on cultural values and social responsibility. This approach elevated her speech from family storytelling to societal analysis, demonstrating the kind of thoughtful perspective that would serve her well in her new role as a Hamilton family member. Part 5, Public Diminishment. Victoria's confidence seemed to grow with each word as she sensed the audience's engagement with her narrative, their nodding heads and attentive expressions confirming that her analysis was resonating with Portland's social elite. She paused momentarily to sip her champagne, a theatrical gesture that heightened the dramatic impact of her observations while demonstrating the kind of polished presentation skills that had helped her navigate these exclusive social circles so successfully. Let me be more specific about Maya's journey because I think the details illustrate important lessons about the difference between dreaming and planning, Victoria continued, her voice carrying a tone of loving concern that made her criticisms seem motivated by genuine sisterly affection rather than malice. After college, Maya took a teaching position at a private elementary school here in Portland. It was exactly the kind of stable, respectable job that should have provided a foundation for building a successful career. The mention of my teaching background created a stir of recognition among several guests who worked in education or served on private school boards. They understood the value of such positions, particularly at prestigious institutions that catered to families like those represented in tonight's gathering. The implicit suggestion that I'd abandon this secure opportunity for more uncertain pursuits reinforced their assumptions about my poor decision-making abilities. But Maya wasn't satisfied with teaching, Victoria explained, shaking her head with the kind of gentle disappointment typically reserved for discussing talented individuals who'd squandered their potential. She convinced herself that she needed something more creative, more entrepreneurial. So she left her teaching job to try marketing for a small nonprofit organization, trading job security for the chance to pursue what she called her passion for social impact work. Uncle Tom released a barely audible sigh that captured the sentiments of many guests who'd witnessed similar stories of young people abandoning practical career paths for idealistic pursuits. His expression conveyed the kind of worldly wisdom that comes from decades of observing the consequences of impractical decisions, the understanding that passion rarely compensates for poor planning and unrealistic expectations about professional success. The nonprofit sector represented familiar territory for many attendees who served on charitable boards and understood the financial challenges facing organizations dependent on donations and grant funding. Victoria's description of my marketing work in this context suggested that I'd chosen to pursue meaningful but financially unsustainable employment, prioritizing personal fulfillment over economic reality in ways that reflected broader generational differences about work and money. The marketing position lasted about 18 months before budget cuts eliminated Maya's role, Victoria continued, her tone suggesting that this outcome had been entirely predictable to anyone with realistic expectations about nonprofit sustainability. Instead of returning to teaching or finding similar work in a more stable organization, Maya decided this was the perfect opportunity to launch her own event planning business. She was convinced that her marketing experience had prepared her to build something extraordinary. The entrepreneurial failure narrative struck a particularly resonant chord with guests who'd built their own fortunes through careful planning and gradual expansion rather than dramatic leaps into independent business ownership. They appreciated Victoria's implicit critique of the popular mythology surrounding startup culture, the unrealistic expectations that encouraged people to view business ownership as a path to rapid success rather than a challenging undertaking requiring substantial capital and extensive preparation. Marcus's father leaned forward slightly, his expression reflecting the kind of professional interest that came from decades of evaluating business proposals and investment opportunities. His shipping empire had been built through conservative expansion and calculated risk-taking, approaches that stood in stark contrast to the impulsive entrepreneurship Victoria was describing. Her analysis aligned with his own observations about the differences between sustainable business practices and amateur attempts at commercial success. Maya's event planning venture lasted almost 3 years, Victoria said, pausing to let the timeline sink in while guests calculated the financial implications of such an extended struggle. She organized birthday parties, small corporate events, a few modest weddings. The work was creative and personally fulfilling, exactly what she'd dreamed of doing. But it never generated enough income to support the kind of lifestyle most people expect as adults. The specific mention of birthday parties and small corporate events created a striking contrast to the grandeur of the evening's celebration, where every detail reflected significant financial investment and access to Portland's most exclusive vendors. Guests could easily imagine the difference between the modest events Maya had organized and the sophisticated gathering they were currently enjoying, reinforcing their understanding of the gap between amateur event coordination and professional-level celebration management. Amanda Wells captured my expression with her phone camera, ensuring that documentation of this moment would include my reaction to Victoria's detailed enumeration of my apparent failures. The photographer had also positioned himself to record the interaction between sisters, understanding that these personal moments often became the most treasured components of wedding albums and social media narratives about significant family celebrations. The financial reality eventually forced Maya to close her event planning business and return to freelance work, Victoria explained, her voice carrying the kind of gentle sadness typically associated with discussing beloved family members who'd struggled with addiction or chronic illness. She's been trying to make ends meet as an independent contractor, taking on small projects that barely cover her rent on a modest apartment in southeast Portland. The geographic reference to Southeast Portland carried particular significance for guests familiar with the city's residential patterns, where housing costs reflected neighborhood desirability and resident income levels. Victoria's description placed me firmly in the category of people who couldn't afford the West Hills mansions or Pearl District condominiums that housed most of the evening's attendees, reinforcing assumptions about my economic status and social position. My parents' faces reflected a mixture of embarrassment and protective concern as Victoria shared details about my living situation with 300 of Portland's most prominent residents. They'd never intended for their daughter's personal struggles to become the subject of public discussion at such a high-profile social event, but they also recognized Victoria's right to share family stories that illustrated important life lessons about responsibility and practical decision-making. Maya drives a 12-year-old Honda CR-V that she bought used, Victoria continued, adding automotive details that further emphasized the contrast between my apparent circumstances and the luxury vehicles filling Riverside Manor's valet parking area. She's always talking about her next big opportunity, the project that's going to finally provide the breakthrough she's been seeking. But after watching this pattern repeat itself for nearly a decade, I've learned to recognize the difference between realistic planning and wishful thinking. The vehicle reference prompted several guests to glance toward the windows overlooking the parking area, where Maseratis, BMWs, and Tesla Model S sedans created a display of automotive luxury that reinforced the evening's atmosphere of financial success. The mention of my aging Honda among this collection of high-end vehicles provided a concrete symbol of the economic disparity Victoria was describing, making her observations about practical decision-making seem particularly relevant and insightful. The catering staff continued their efficient service throughout Victoria's speech, their black uniforms creating a subtle backdrop for the evening's formal programming, while ensuring that guests' champagne flutes remained appropriately filled. Their professional discretion meant that the speech could proceed without interruption, maintaining the sophisticated atmosphere that had characterized the entire celebration from its opening moments. I want to be clear that I love Maya deeply, and I admire her creativity and persistence, Victoria said, her expression radiating the kind of unconditional family affection that made her criticisms seem motivated by genuine concern rather than competitive jealousy. But I've also learned important lessons from watching her struggle with the consequences of impractical choices. Those lessons have helped me understand the value of building relationships with successful people, of choosing partners who share realistic goals, of planning for the future rather than simply hoping everything will work out. The philosophical framework Victoria was constructing elevated her personal observations into broader commentary about life strategies and social responsibility, demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking that had impressed the Hamilton family during her courtship with Marcus. Her ability to transform family dynamics into teachable moments reflected the kind of wisdom they valued in their son's choice of spouse, suggesting that she understood the importance of learning from both positive and negative examples. The ballroom's acoustic design ensured that every word carried clearly to guests throughout the space, including those seated at tables near the windows overlooking the Willamette River. The venue's sophisticated audio system had been calibrated specifically for events where speeches played a central role, ensuring that even subtle vocal inflections would be audible to everyone present during this moment of family storytelling and social commentary. Part 6. The false moral. Victoria's champagne flute caught the crystal chandelier's light as she prepared to deliver what was clearly the culmination of her carefully constructed narrative about success, family responsibility, and the importance of making practical life choices. The 300 guests leaned forward with the kind of anticipation typically reserved for profound moments of wisdom sharing, their expressions reflecting appreciation for the thoughtful analysis they'd witnessed throughout her speech about the contrasting paths siblings could take through life. What I've learned from watching Maya's journey is that good intentions aren't enough, Victoria declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd achieved everything she'd set out to accomplish in her 28 years. Creativity and passion are wonderful qualities, but they need to be balanced with realism and practical planning. The most important lesson Maya has taught me is the value of choosing stability over uncertainty, of building relationships with people who can provide guidance and support, rather than pursuing dreams in isolation. The Hamilton family members nodded approvingly at Victoria's synthesis, their expressions suggesting satisfaction with her ability to extract meaningful insights from personal family experiences. This approach to learning from both positive and negative examples reflected values they'd instilled in their own children, the understanding that wisdom often came from observing the consequences of different approaches to life's challenges and opportunities. Marcus reached over to squeeze Victoria's free hand, his gesture reinforcing their partnership while demonstrating his appreciation for her analytical thinking and emotional intelligence. The photographer captured this moment of support between husband and wife, understanding that such intimate interactions often became treasured components of wedding documentation. Their connection embodied the kind of practical romance Victoria was advocating, a relationship built on shared values and realistic expectations, rather than purely emotional attraction. When I first started dating Marcus, I was initially intimidated by his family's success and social position, Victoria continued, her honesty creating a moment of vulnerability that made her subsequent observations seem more authentic and relatable. But I realized that their achievements weren't the result of luck or privilege alone. They represented generations of careful decision-making, strategic relationship building, and commitment to values that prioritize long-term stability over short-term gratification. The guests appreciated Victoria's acknowledgement of the hard work and planning that had created the Hamilton family's fortune, understanding that such success rarely resulted from chance alone. Her recognition of these factors demonstrated the kind of mature perspective that would serve her well in her new role as a member of Portland's established elite, someone who understood the responsibility that came with inherited wealth and social influence. Aunt Helen dabbed her eyes with her napkin, clearly moved by Victoria's eloquent articulation of family lessons and personal growth. The emotional impact of the speech was becoming increasingly apparent throughout the ballroom, with guests responding to both the intimate family details and the broader philosophical framework Victoria had constructed around her observations about success and responsibility. Maya's struggles have helped me understand that security isn't something to be taken for granted, Victoria explained, her tone becoming more serious as she prepared to deliver what seemed to be the central message of her entire presentation: the ability to plan for the future, to build something lasting, to contribute meaningfully to your community. These privileges require the kind of stability that can only come from making wise choices about career, relationships, and personal priorities. The professional women in attendance responded particularly strongly to Victoria's comments about career stability and community contribution, recognizing the challenges facing individuals who chose entrepreneurial paths without adequate preparation or support systems. Many had witnessed similar stories of talented people whose creative ambitions weren't matched by practical business skills or realistic understanding of market conditions and consumer demands. The venue's sophisticated lighting system created dramatic shadows across Victoria's face as she continued her speech, the visual effects adding gravitas to her words while reinforcing the elegant atmosphere that had characterized the entire evening. Riverside Manor Estate's ballroom had hosted countless important speeches over the years, from political fundraising addresses to corporate presentation ceremonies, and tonight's remarks were clearly joining that distinguished tradition. I want Maya to understand that there's no shame in choosing a more traditional path, Victoria said, turning to look directly at me with an expression of loving concern that made her words seem motivated by genuine sisterly affection rather than competitive superiority. There are opportunities available for people with her skills and creativity, positions in established organizations where she could make meaningful contributions while building the kind of financial security that allows for long-term planning and family formation. The implicit suggestion that my current path was was incompatible with traditional markers of adult success. Financial security, family formation, long-term planning resonated strongly with guests who'd achieved such milestones through conventional career trajectories. Success and responsibility. Marriage has taught me so much about the importance of partnership, of choosing to build something together rather than pursuing individual dreams that might not align with practical realities, Victoria said, her voice rising slightly as she prepared to deliver what was clearly the climactic moment of her speech. Marcus and I share a vision for our future that's based on realistic expectations, mutual support, and commitment to values that will help us contribute meaningfully to our community while building something lasting for the next generation. The guests responded with appreciative murmurs, recognizing the wisdom behind Victoria's observations about marriage and partnership, while appreciating her ability to connect personal insights to broader social values. Her remarks reflected the kind of mature thinking that would serve her well in her new role as a Hamilton family member, someone who understood the responsibility that came with wealth and social position. Tonight represents everything I've learned about the difference between dreams and goals, Victoria declared, raising her champagne flute higher as she prepared to conclude her remarks with a toast that would crystallize her message about practical wisdom and family responsibility. Dreams are wonderful, but they need to be grounded in reality. Goals require planning, partnership, and the kind of practical decision-making that creates lasting success rather than temporary satisfaction. The philosophical distinction Victoria was drawing between dreams and goals resonated powerfully with guests who'd built their own success through careful planning and strategic thinking rather than impulsive pursuit of creative passions. Her analysis provided a framework for understanding the difference between wishful thinking and realistic ambition, between romantic idealism and mature pragmatism. Marcus's father nodded approvingly at Victoria's conclusion, his expression suggesting satisfaction with her demonstration of the kind of analytical thinking and value system that would make her a worthy addition to the Hamilton family legacy. Her speech had showcased exactly the kind of wisdom and maturity they valued in their son's choice of spouse, someone who understood the importance of learning from both positive and negative examples within her own family experience. Maya, I hope tonight helps you understand what genuine success looks like, Victoria said, addressing me directly with an expression that conveyed both affection and gentle concern. I hope you'll consider pursuing opportunities that offer real security and the chance to build something meaningful within established structures, rather than continuing to chase uncertain dreams that may never materialize into practical reality. The personal nature of Victoria's direct address created a moment of intense focus throughout the ballroom, with every guest's attention concentrated on the interaction between sisters while they waited to see how I might respond to such public guidance and familial concern. The photographer adjusted his position to capture both Victoria's earnest expression and my reaction to her heartfelt advice about career choices and life priorities. I want to toast my sister Maya tonight, Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom's sophisticated acoustic space, while she prepared to conclude her speech with a gesture of family solidarity, despite the critical analysis she'd shared. Maya, may you find the wisdom to choose stability over uncertainty, may you discover the joy that comes from building something lasting rather than chasing temporary satisfactions, and may you learn to appreciate the value of partnership and practical planning in creating a truly successful life. The guests began raising their champagne flutes in preparation for the toast, their synchronized movement creating a visual spectacle that reinforced the formal nature of the evening's celebration while demonstrating their collective endorsement of Victoria's message about wisdom, responsibility, and the importance of making practical life choices. The crystal glasses caught the chandelier light magnificently, creating a sparkling display that added visual drama to the moment's emotional intensity. To Maya, Victoria declared, her voice ringing with the kind of confident authority that had characterized her entire presentation. May marriage and family teach her what ambition alone never could about the true meaning of success and fulfillment in life. The toast's wording created a final moment of dramatic emphasis, suggesting that Victoria's own marriage represented the culmination of wisdom gained through observing both successful and unsuccessful approaches to adult life. Her implication that marriage and family provided insights unavailable through individual achievement reinforced the evening's themes about partnership, stability, and the importance of choosing proven paths over experimental ones. Part 7, Disruption Moment. The synchronized lifting of 300 champagne flutes created a crystalline symphony that filled Riverside Manor's ballroom, the collective gesture reinforcing Victoria's message about wisdom, family responsibility, and the importance of learning from both positive and negative examples within one's immediate social circle. The guests' expressions reflected appreciation for her eloquent analysis and thoughtful guidance, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of witnessing what they clearly considered a profound moment of sisterly love and practical wisdom sharing. I raised my own glass with the same gracious smile I'd maintained throughout Victoria's speech, my expression conveying appropriate gratitude for her concern, while revealing nothing about the seismic shift that was about to transform this celebration from a display of established social hierarchy into something far more complex and unexpected. The weight of the crystal flute felt substantial in my hand, a tangible reminder of the luxury surrounding us and the assumptions that luxury had generated about success, failure, and belonging. The moment stretched with perfect theatrical timing, 300 of Portland's most influential residents poised to drink to Victoria's toast, while photographers captured the scene for posterity and social media documentation. The ballroom's sophisticated lighting system cast dramatic shadows across the assembled guests, creating an atmosphere of elegant formality that would make the coming disruption seem even more shocking by contrast. Then David Miller's voice cut through the crystalline silence with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in rooms filled with powerful people. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but I have an important announcement that I believe will interest everyone present tonight. His words carried the crisp professionalism that had made him one of Portland's most respected venue managers, someone whose expertise was trusted by the city's elite families for their most significant occasions. The guests lowered their champagne flutes slowly, their expressions shifting from celebratory anticipation to curious confusion as they tried to understand why the evening's formal programming was being interrupted by venue staff. David Miller's reputation for discretion and perfect timing made his intervention particularly surprising, suggesting that whatever announcement he was prepared to make must be genuinely significant rather than routine operational information. Victoria's smile faltered slightly as she realized that her carefully orchestrated moment was being disrupted by forces beyond her control. The speech she'd spent weeks preparing, and the toast that was meant to crystallize her message about practical wisdom and family responsibility, had been interrupted just as she was achieving maximum dramatic impact. Her champagne flute remained suspended mid-air, creating a frozen tableau that perfectly captured the suspension between her intended conclusion and whatever unexpected development was about to unfold. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression reflecting the kind of professional alertness that came from years of attending corporate events where unexpected announcements often carried significant business implications. His experience in Portland's financial sector had taught him to recognize the subtle cues that preceded important revelations, and David Miller's demeanor suggested that whatever information he was about to share would have substantial impact on the evening's dynamics. As many of you know, Riverside Manor Estate has been Portland's premier wedding and celebration venue for over 15 years. David continued, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom's expertly designed acoustic space. We've had the privilege of hosting countless memorable events for the Pacific Northwest's most distinguished families, and tonight's celebration certainly continues that tradition of excellence and sophistication. The guests nodded appreciatively at David's recognition of the venue's prestigious reputation and their own status as members of Portland's social elite. Riverside Manor Estate's exclusivity was a source of pride for families who'd celebrated significant milestones within its elegant walls, and the waiting lists for premium dates reinforced the sense that securing time here represented a meaningful achievement in itself. The photographer had shifted his attention from the head table to David Miller, recognizing that whatever announcement was about to unfold would likely become a significant component of the evening's documentation. His professional instincts suggested that unexpected moments often created the most memorable images, and he positioned himself to capture both the venue manager's remarks and the guests' reactions to them. Tonight's celebration has special significance beyond the obvious joy of witnessing Victoria and Marcus begin their married life together, David said, pausing slightly to ensure that every guest was fully focused on his words. This evening marks a milestone in Riverside Manor Estate's own history, one that I believe will surprise and delight everyone present, particularly the Hamilton and Johnson families. The mention of both families by name created a ripple of increased attention throughout the ballroom, with relatives on both sides leaning forward to better understand how the venue's announcement might relate to their personal celebration. The formal nature of David's presentation suggested that this was more than routine congratulations or standard venue acknowledgments, indicating instead that some genuinely significant revelation was about to unfold. Victoria's confusion was becoming increasingly apparent as she struggled to understand how the venue's history could possibly relate to her wedding celebration or warrant interrupting the evening's formal programming. She'd booked Riverside Manor Estate through the standard reservation process, working with the events team to coordinate every detail of the evening's sophisticated celebration, and nothing in that process had suggested any special circumstances or unusual arrangements. For the past 5 years, Riverside Manor Estate has been owned and operated by Pacific Event Holdings, a hospitality company that has quietly built one of the Pacific Northwest's most successful luxury event portfolios, David explained, his professional demeanor remaining calm and composed despite the growing tension in the ballroom. Tonight I have the privilege of revealing the identity of Pacific Event Holdings founder and CEO, someone who has remained anonymous throughout the company's remarkable growth and success. The business executives in attendance immediately recognized the significance of David's announcement, understanding that hospitality empires worth tens of millions of dollars rarely remained under anonymous ownership without deliberate strategic reasons. Their expressions reflected professional curiosity about the identity of someone who'd built such substantial success while maintaining complete privacy about their personal involvement in the industry. My heart rate increased slightly as the moment I'd been anticipating for months finally arrived, the carefully planned revelation that would transform every assumption the assembled guests had formed about my place in their social and economic hierarchy. The timing had been coordinated perfectly, following immediately after Victoria's speech about practical wisdom and realistic goal setting, creating maximum dramatic contrast between perception and reality. Uncle Tom's eyebrows rose as he began to process the potential implications of David's announcement, his business experience suggesting that the revelation of a major company's ownership structure at a family wedding could only mean that someone present had more significant connections to the venue than they'd previously disclosed. His expression reflected the kind of dawning realization that often preceded major shifts in understanding about family dynamics and social relationships. Pacific Event Holdings was founded by someone in this room tonight, David continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from delivering information that will fundamentally alter how people understand their immediate circumstances. Someone who has spent years building an extraordinary business empire while maintaining the privacy necessary to operate effectively in the highly competitive luxury hospitality market. Amanda Wells had her phone ready to record whatever revelation was about to unfold, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing the kind of unexpected moment that would generate significant social media engagement and become part of Portland's social history. Her position near the head table provided an excellent vantage point for capturing both the announcement itself and the family members' reactions to it. The catering staff had quietly positioned themselves around the ballroom's perimeter, their professional training having prepared them to maintain service standards, even during unexpected disruptions to formal programming. Their discretion ensured that the dramatic moment could unfold without operational distractions, while their strategic positioning allowed them to observe the reactions of guests they'd served at countless high society events over the years. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, his voice rising slightly as he prepared to deliver the revelation that would transform the evening from a celebration of established social hierarchy into something far more complex and surprising. "It is my honor to introduce the founder and CEO of Pacific Event Holdings, the woman whose vision and leadership have made tonight's celebration possible in ways you never could have imagined." The silence that followed was complete and profound, broken only by the gentle hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of river traffic beyond the manor's windows. 300 of Portland's most influential residents held their collective breath, waiting to discover which among them had been concealing such extraordinary business success behind a facade of conventional social positioning. Part 8, Truth Revelation. Maya Johnson, David Miller announced, his voice ringing clearly across the ballroom's stunned silence as he gestured in my direction with the kind of professional respect typically reserved for introducing distinguished keynote speakers at major corporate events. The founder and CEO of Pacific Event Holdings, owner of Riverside Manor Estate and 11 other premier venues throughout the Pacific Northwest, architect of a hospitality empire that was just acquired by Meridian Hospitality International for $200 million. The champagne flute slipped from Victoria's trembling fingers, the crystal shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the absolute silence that had engulfed the ballroom. 300 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from complete disbelief to dawning recognition, their carefully maintained social composure cracking under the weight of information that contradicted every assumption they'd formed about my place in their hierarchy. Marcus Hamilton's jaw dropped as he processed the implications of David's announcement, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the image of his wife's struggling sister with the reality of someone who just personally netted nearly $150 million from the largest hospitality acquisition in Pacific Northwest history. The shipping fortune that had defined his family's social position for generations suddenly seemed modest in comparison to the empire I'd built while living in apparent obscurity. My parents stared at me with expressions of complete bewilderment, their faces reflecting the kind of profound confusion that comes from discovering that everything they thought they knew about their daughter's circumstances had been an elaborate fiction maintained for half a decade. Dad's hands shook slightly as he reached for his water glass, while Mom pressed her napkin to her mouth as if trying to prevent an involuntary exclamation. Pacific Event Holdings' portfolio includes not only Riverside Manor Estate but also the Cascade Lodge in Mount Hood, the Pearl District Event Center, the historic Armory Ballroom, and the Willamette Valley Wine Estate, David continued, his professional delivery lending credibility to revelations that seemed too extraordinary to believe. Miss Johnson has built the Pacific Northwest's most successful luxury event company while maintaining complete anonymity, operating through shell corporations and trust structures that protected her privacy throughout the company's remarkable growth. Aunt Helen gripped Uncle Tom's arm with enough force to make him wince, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his suit jacket as she struggled to process information that challenged fundamental assumptions about family dynamics and social positioning. The niece they'd been pitying for years as a struggling freelancer had apparently been operating at a level of business success that exceeded most of their own entrepreneurial achievements. The Hamilton family members exchanged glances that reflected a mixture of shock, reassessment, and the kind of rapid social calculation that comes from realizing that the family dynamics they'd understood were built on completely inaccurate information. Eleanor Hamilton's pearls trembled slightly against her collarbone as she processed the reality that her son had married into a family with significantly more wealth than she'd previously understood. The acquisition by Meridian Hospitality International was finalized this afternoon, David explained, consulting his phone to confirm the precise timing. While the assembled guests struggled to absorb the magnitude of the revelation, Miss Johnson will remain as CEO of the Pacific Northwest Division, while expanding her hospitality concepts to markets throughout North America. Forbes has confirmed plans for a cover story about her success in building what they're calling the hospitality industry's most impressive stealth empire. Amanda Wells had recovered from her initial shock enough to begin recording with her phone, her social media instincts, recognizing that she was witnessing the kind of extraordinary revelation that would generate massive online engagement and establish her as the primary source for one of Portland's most surprising business stories. Her position near the head table provided an perfect vantage point for documenting both the announcement and the family reactions to it. The professional event planners and hospitality industry executives in attendance began nodding with grudging recognition as they processed the implications of David's announcement. They'd wondered for years about the anonymous ownership structure behind Pacific Event Holdings, and several had competed unsuccessfully for contracts with venues that were apparently under my ultimate control throughout the bidding processes. Miss Johnson's success has been particularly remarkable given her age and the competitive nature of the luxury hospitality market, David continued. His presentation maintaining the professional tone that had characterized his entire announcement, despite the extraordinary nature of the information he was sharing. At 31, she becomes one of the youngest hospitality industry leaders to achieve a 9-figure exit, while maintaining the operational excellence that has made her venues the preferred choice for the Pacific Northwest's most discerning clients. The age reference created an additional layer of shock among guests who'd been operating under the assumption that significant business success required decades of career development and gradual wealth accumulation. My achievement of such extraordinary results, while still in my early 30s, challenged their fundamental understanding of how fortunes were built and maintained in contemporary American business environments. Victoria remained frozen in her chair, her wedding dress creating a striking tableau of bridal elegance, rendered motionless by revelations that had completely undermined the narrative structure of her carefully prepared speech. The sister she'd just finished describing as a cautionary tale about impractical dreaming had apparently achieved business success that exceeded anything the Hamilton family had accomplished across multiple generations. The 12 venues in Miss Johnson's portfolio have hosted over 2,000 events during the past 5 years, generating revenues that placed Pacific Event Holdings among the region's fastest-growing private companies, David said, providing concrete details that helped the assembled guests understand the scope of the business empire they'd been unknowingly supporting through their patronage of exclusive venues throughout the Pacific Northwest. Marcus's father leaned back in his chair, with the expression of someone whose worldview was undergoing fundamental revision, his shipping industry expertise providing context for understanding exactly how remarkable it was to build such substantial success in the highly competitive hospitality sector. The Hamilton family's own business achievements suddenly seemed less impressive in comparison to what a single individual had accomplished while maintaining complete anonymity. The photographer had positioned himself to capture the dramatic contrast between Victoria's stunned silence and my composed demeanor, understanding instinctively that these images would become historic documentation of one of Portland's most extraordinary family revelations. His professional experience had taught him to recognize moments when social hierarchies shifted dramatically, and tonight's events clearly represented such a transformation. Miss Johnson's success has been built on a foundation of exceptional operational excellence, innovative venue design, and strategic market positioning that has consistently exceeded client expectations while maintaining profit margins that attracted acquisition interest from multiple international hospitality corporations, David explained. His detailed analysis helping guests understand that my success wasn't the result of luck or favorable circumstances, but rather represented genuine business acumen applied consistently over multiple years. The business terminology and financial specifics in David's presentation lent additional credibility to revelations that might otherwise have seemed too extraordinary to believe, while also demonstrating that my success had been achieved through conventional business excellence rather than speculative ventures or high-risk investment strategies that might have been dismissed as unsustainable or unreplicable. Cousin Jessica had recovered enough from her initial shock to begin calculating the social implications of David's announcement, her expression reflecting the kind of rapid status reassessment that characterized Portland's competitive social environment. The family member she'd been treating with polite condescension throughout the evening had apparently achieved wealth that placed her among the region's most successful entrepreneurs. The Meridian acquisition includes provisions for Miss Johnson to expand her hospitality concepts to major markets, including Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver, David continued, outlining future plans that emphasize the national scope of opportunities that would flow from the evening's revelation. Industry analysts expect her to become one of the hospitality sector's most influential leaders over the next decade. The forward-looking nature of David's comments helped guests understand that tonight's revelation wasn't simply about past achievements but represented the foundation for even greater future success, positioning me as someone whose influence and wealth would likely continue growing rather than remaining static at already extraordinary levels. Ladies and gentlemen, David concluded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered countless important announcements during his career, managing prestigious venues. Please join me in congratulating Maya Johnson on her remarkable achievement and thanking her for making tonight's celebration possible in ways that extend far beyond what any of us previously understood. Part 9, Dignified Response. The silence that followed David Miller's announcement stretched across Riverside Manor's ballroom like a physical presence. 300 of Portland's most influential residents struggling to process information that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the evening's social dynamics. I stood slowly, smoothing down my simple black target dress that had suddenly transformed from a symbol of modest means into the understated uniform of someone confident enough in their success to eschew flashy displays of wealth. The movement seemed to break the spell that had held the room captive since David's revelation, guests turning their full attention toward me as I prepared to address them for the first time as the revealed owner of the venue where they were celebrating. My composure remained completely intact, the same calm demeanor I'd maintained throughout Victoria's speech, now taking on entirely different significance, as evidence of the self-control that had enabled me to build a hospitality empire while maintaining complete anonymity. Thank you, David, for that introduction, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the ballroom's sophisticated acoustic space, with the kind of natural authority that comes from years of addressing high-stakes business meetings and investor presentations. I suppose it's time to address the elephant in the room, though I have to admit, I never expected my business activities to become the evening's entertainment at my sister's wedding celebration. The gentle humor in my opening remarks helped ease some of the tension that had gripped the assembled guests, while also establishing a tone of gracious professionalism that contrasted sharply with the shock and confusion visible on faces throughout the ballroom. My ability to maintain composure under such extraordinary circumstances demonstrated the kind of leadership presence that had enabled me to succeed in the competitive hospitality industry. Victoria remained frozen in her chair, her champagne flute scattered in crystal fragments around her feet while she struggled to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the business mogul who'd just been revealed as the architect of a $200 million hospitality empire. The wedding dress that had made her look like a fairy tale princess now seemed somehow diminished in comparison to the quiet power radiating from someone who'd achieved extraordinary success without needing external validation. I want to begin by congratulating Victoria and Marcus on their beautiful wedding, I continued, turning toward the head table with an expression of genuine warmth that emphasized my priority on family celebration despite the dramatic revelation that had just unfolded. This venue has hosted thousands of celebrations over the past 5 years, but tonight holds special significance because it brings together two families that I care about deeply, even when our relationships have been complicated. The acknowledgement of family complexity created a moment of emotional honesty that resonated with guests who understood that successful families often navigated challenging dynamics beneath their public facades. My willingness to address these complications directly while maintaining respect for the evening's celebratory purpose demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence that had likely contributed to my business success. Marcus Hamilton had recovered enough from his initial shock to lean forward with obvious professional interest, his expression reflecting the kind of respect that one successful entrepreneur shows toward another, while trying to understand how such extraordinary achievement had remained hidden from his family's extensive Portland business networks. The shipping fortune that had defined his social position suddenly seemed less impressive in comparison to what I'd accomplished independently. Many of you are probably wondering how I managed to build Pacific Event Holdings while maintaining complete privacy about my involvement, I said, addressing the curiosity that was clearly consuming most of the assembled guests. The answer is relatively simple, though it required considerable discipline and strategic planning. I made a deliberate choice to separate my personal life from my professional activities, understanding that anonymity would provide advantages in both business negotiations and family relationships. The business rationale I was outlining helped guests understand that my deception hadn't been motivated by shame or insecurity but rather represented a sophisticated strategy for protecting both commercial interests and personal privacy. This explanation elevated my actions from mere secrecy to strategic thinking, demonstrating the kind of analytical approach that characterized successful entrepreneurs and business leaders. My parents continued staring at me with expressions of complete bewilderment, their faces reflecting the profound disorientation that comes from discovering that fundamental assumptions about their child's circumstances had been maintained through years of careful misdirection. Dad's hands trembled slightly as he processed the implications of having a daughter whose business success exceeded anything he'd imagined possible during his own accounting career. The hospitality industry requires extensive relationship management and careful attention to client confidentiality, I explained, providing context that helped the professional event planners and business executives in attendance understand the practical reasons behind my anonymity. Operating under corporate structures allowed me to focus on building exceptional venues and services without the complications that often arise when personal relationships intersect with commercial activities. The industry-specific details I was sharing demonstrated comprehensive understanding of hospitality business dynamics while also providing cover for the family deception I'd maintained throughout the company's development. My explanation suggested that the secrecy had been professionally motivated rather than personally driven, making my actions seem more understandable to guests who worked in competitive business environments. Aunt Helen had finally released her grip on Uncle Tom's arm, though her expression continued reflecting the kind of profound shock that accompanies major revisions to long-held family narratives. The niece she'd been treating with polite pity throughout family gatherings had apparently been operating at a level of business success that exceeded most of their peer group's entrepreneurial achievements. I want to address Victoria's speech directly because her observations about my career path deserve a response, I said, turning toward my sister with an expression that conveyed both affection and gentle correction. Victoria was absolutely right that I've taken an unconventional approach to building my professional life. What she didn't understand was that each apparent failure was actually a strategic step toward larger goals. The reframing of my career history from a series of failed ventures to strategic preparation for entrepreneurial success created a collective intake of breath among guests who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about my struggles had been completely inaccurate. My ability to transform criticism into vindication while maintaining respect for Victoria demonstrated remarkable emotional control and strategic thinking. The photographer had positioned himself to capture both sisters during this moment of direct address, understanding that these images would become historic documentation of one of Portland's most extraordinary family revelations. His professional experience had taught him to recognize when social dynamics shifted dramatically, and tonight's events clearly represented a fundamental transfer in family hierarchy. My teaching experience taught me about client service and attention to detail. I continued systematically recontextualizing each element of Victoria's critique as evidence of deliberate career development. The nonprofit marketing work provided insights into budget management and donor relations that proved invaluable when developing pricing strategies for luxury events. Even the event planning business served as market research, helping me understand client needs and operational challenges from the ground level. The systematic explanation of how each career move had contributed to my ultimate success helped guests understand that my unconventional path had been driven by strategic thinking rather than impulsive decision-making. This revelation transformed their perception of my choices from evidence of poor judgment to demonstration of sophisticated long-term planning. Amanda Wells had recovered from her initial shock enough to resume recording with her phone, her social media instincts recognizing that she was documenting one of Portland's most remarkable business stories while also witnessing a family dynamic that would generate significant online engagement. Her position near the head table provided excellent access for capturing both my composed delivery and the various reactions throughout the ballroom. The modest apartment Victoria mentioned is actually a strategic choice rather than a financial necessity, I said, addressing one of the most pointed elements of her speech with the same calm professionalism that had characterized my entire response. When you're building a business that depends on client confidentiality and discreet operations, maintaining a low personal profile becomes essential rather than accidental. The business justification for my modest lifestyle helped guests understand that my apparent struggles had been carefully constructed rather than genuinely experienced, while also demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that separated successful entrepreneurs from those who pursued business ownership without adequate planning or preparation. The Honda CR-V that Victoria referenced serves similar purposes. I continued addressing another specific detail from her speech while maintaining the tone of gentle education rather than defensive correction. Arriving at business meetings and modest transportation often provides negotiating advantages, while also maintaining the privacy that has been essential to Pacific Event Holdings' operational success. The revelation that even my vehicle choice had been strategically motivated helped guests understand the comprehensive nature of the deception I'd maintained, while also providing insight into the sophisticated thinking that had enabled me to build such extraordinary business success while remaining completely anonymous within Portland's competitive hospitality market. The Hamilton family members were beginning to exchange glances that reflected rapid reassessment of family dynamics and social positioning, their expressions suggesting recognition that the wedding had joined their established fortune to wealth that significantly exceeded their own multi-generational accumulation. Eleanor Hamilton's pearls no longer seemed quite as impressive in comparison to the understated confidence of someone who'd just achieved a 9-figure business exit. I want to thank Victoria for her concern about my future prospects, I said, returning to direct address of my sister with an expression that conveyed genuine appreciation for her intentions despite the painful nature of her public criticism. Her observations about security and stability are absolutely valid, which is why I've spent the past 5 years building exactly the kind of sustainable business foundation she was encouraging me to seek through traditional employment. The gracious acknowledgement of Victoria's good intentions while simultaneously demonstrating that I'd already achieved her recommended goals created a moment of profound emotional complexity, showing both sisters grappling with the collapse of assumptions that had defined their relationship for years. My ability to maintain love and respect while correcting misconceptions demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity. Pacific Event Holdings employs over 200 people throughout the Pacific Northwest, providing exactly the kind of stable career opportunities Victoria described. I continued, expanding the scope of my response to address broader themes about employment and economic responsibility. The company offers comprehensive benefits, professional development programs, and the kind of long-term security that comes from building sustainable business operations rather than pursuing speculative ventures. The employment statistics helped guests understand that my success had created opportunities for others rather than representing purely personal achievement, while also demonstrating that my business operations embodied the values Victoria had been advocating throughout her speech about responsibility and community contribution. Tonight's celebration represents the culmination of strategic planning that began during my college years, I said, preparing to conclude my response with context that would help guests understand the timeline and sophistication of my business development. Building Pacific Event Holdings required patience, discipline, and exactly the kind of practical decision-making Victoria was describing, though perhaps implemented in ways that weren't immediately visible to outside observers. The long-term perspective I was providing helped guests appreciate that my success hadn't been achieved through luck or favorable circumstances, but rather represented years of careful planning and consistent execution of a comprehensive business strategy. This explanation elevated my achievements from surprising revelations to evidence of sustained excellence in competitive markets. Part 10. Power Reversal. The collective realization of what my revelation meant began spreading through the ballroom like ripples across still water, guests exchanging meaningful glances as they processed the implications of discovering that the woman they'd been pitying throughout the evening actually owned the venue where they were celebrating. The shift in social dynamics was becoming increasingly apparent as Portland's elite recalibrated their understanding of family hierarchies and business relationships that had suddenly been revealed as far more complex than they'd previously understood. Marcus Hamilton's expression reflected the kind of professional respect that one successful entrepreneur shows toward another, though his face also conveyed the disorientation that comes from realizing that major business relationships had been operating without his knowledge. The Hamilton shipping empire had likely intersected with my hospitality businesses through various corporate events and client celebrations, creating a web of connections that had remained invisible until tonight's revelation. I want to address some specific points that Victoria raised about practical decision-making and financial planning. I continued, my voice maintaining the same composed authority that had characterized my response while gradually building toward more pointed observations about the ironies embedded in the evening's circumstances. She was absolutely correct that building sustainable wealth requires careful attention to details and long-term strategic thinking. The agreement with Victoria's general principles while preparing to demonstrate how dramatically she'd misunderstood their application created a moment of anticipation among guests who were beginning to recognize that additional revelations might be forthcoming. My systematic approach to addressing her criticisms suggested that I had specific responses prepared for each element of her analysis. The Hamilton family's choice of Riverside Manor Estate for tonight's celebration demonstrates exactly the kind of practical decision-making Victoria was describing, I said, turning toward Marcus with an expression of professional appreciation that also carried subtle implications about business relationships. This venue provides exceptional value for clients who understand the importance of choosing established operators with proven track records of excellence. The reference to value and proven track records created a moment of dawning realization among the Hamilton family members, who were beginning to understand that their selection of what they'd considered the most prestigious venue in Portland had actually resulted in financial benefit for the family member they'd been treating with polite condescension throughout the evening's celebration. Uncle Tom's eyebrows rose as he processed the business implications of my comments, his entrepreneurial experience providing context for understanding that significant venue bookings generated substantial revenue for property owners. The family wedding he'd been enjoying was apparently providing financial benefit to a niece whose business acumen he'd consistently underestimated during years of family gatherings. Marcus, I want to thank you personally for Hamilton Shipping's consistent use of our corporate event services, I said, addressing my new brother-in-law directly while revealing information that created visible shock among his family members. Your quarterly board meetings at the Pearl District Event Center have been particularly appreciated, and I understand your father has been pleased with our catering services for investor presentations. The revelation that the Hamilton family's business activities had been generating revenue for my company created a moment of profound silence, as guests processed the implications of learning that established business relationships had been operating without their knowledge. Marcus's father gripped his champagne glass with enough force to make his knuckles whiten as he realized the scope of connections that had remained invisible. Victoria's expression reflected the kind of cognitive dissonance that accompanies the complete collapse of fundamental assumptions about family dynamics and social positioning. The sister she'd just finished describing as someone who needed guidance about practical business decisions had apparently been providing services to the very family she was joining through marriage, creating layers of irony that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. The corporate event business has been particularly rewarding because it allows us to build long-term relationships with Portland's most successful companies, I continued, expanding the scope of my revelation to suggest that additional business connections might exist among the evening's guests. Many of the families represented in tonight's celebration have been Pacific Event Holdings clients, though our discretion policies have prevented us from acknowledging those relationships publicly. The suggestion that other guests might have unknowingly been supporting my business empire created a ripple of nervous laughter and meaningful glances throughout the ballroom, as successful entrepreneurs and corporate executives began questioning whether their own event planning decisions had contributed to the wealth of someone they'd been treating as an unsuccessful family member. Amanda Wells had positioned herself closer to the head table, her phone capturing both my measured delivery and the increasingly dramatic reactions from family members who were discovering that their understanding of business relationships and social hierarchies had been fundamentally inaccurate. Her social media instincts recognized that she was documenting a story that would generate massive engagement across Portland's professional networks. I want to acknowledge Victoria's concern about my old Honda CR-V, because transportation choices do reflect important values about financial responsibility, I said, preparing to address another specific element of her critique while gradually building toward revelations that would demonstrate the comprehensive nature of my strategic deception. She was absolutely right that successful people often make deliberate choices about how they present themselves publicly. The acknowledgement of Victoria's observation while preparing to reveal additional information created a moment of intense anticipation among guests who were beginning to understand that my modest transportation might represent another example of strategic thinking rather than financial limitation. The systematic way I was addressing each criticism suggested that comprehensive responses were available for every element of Victoria's analysis. The CR-V serves specific purposes related to business operations and client confidentiality, I explained, providing context that helped guests understand the professional reasoning behind choices they'd interpreted as evidence of financial struggle. However, I should probably mention that my primary vehicles are housed in a private garage facility near the Pearl District, where climate control and security systems protect investments that require more careful maintenance. The casual reference to multiple vehicles and specialized storage facilities created another layer of revelation about the scope of assets I'd been concealing, while also demonstrating that even seemingly minor details of my lifestyle had been carefully orchestrated to maintain the fiction of modest circumstances. The guests were beginning to realize that virtually everything they'd assumed about my financial situation had been deliberately constructed misdirection. The Hamilton family's expressions reflected the kind of rapid reassessment that occurs when fundamental assumptions about family wealth and social positioning are revealed as completely inaccurate. Eleanor Hamilton's carefully maintained composure was beginning to show strain as she processed the implications of discovering that her son had married into a family with significantly more wealth than her own established fortune. Victoria's observations about my Southeast Portland apartment were also quite accurate. I continued, addressing another specific detail from her speech while maintaining the same tone of appreciative correction that had characterized my entire response. The location does reflect important values about community connection and understanding diverse neighborhood dynamics that inform our business operations throughout the region. The reframing of my residential choice from evidence of financial limitation to strategic business decision-making helped guests understand that even geographic positioning had been carefully considered rather than representing the result of economic constraints. My ability to transform every apparent weakness into evidence of sophisticated planning was becoming increasingly impressive to business leaders in attendance. However, I should clarify that the property Victoria described as a modest apartment is actually the ground floor of a building that I own entirely, I said, delivering information that created visible shock among family members who thought they understood my living circumstances. The upper floors house Pacific Event Holdings corporate offices, creating tax advantages while also providing convenient access to operational oversight responsibilities. The revelation that I owned the building where I appeared to be struggling as a tenant created another moment of profound silence as guests processed the comprehensive nature of the deception I'd maintained throughout years of family interactions. The strategic advantages I was describing demonstrated business sophistication that exceeded most of their own entrepreneurial experience. Cousin Jessica's expression reflected the kind of social calculation that characterizes Portland's competitive environment, her face showing rapid reassessment of family relationships and positioning as she processed the implications of learning that the family member she'd been treating with polite condescension had achieved wealth that placed her among the region's most successful business leaders.
Characterized by mutual respect and strategic thinking, rather than the personal favoritism that sometimes characterized family-owned enterprises. My ability to maintain professional standards while managing personal revelations demonstrated leadership qualities that would serve me well during national expansion. Uncle Tom had recovered enough from his initial shock to lean forward with obvious professional interest, his entrepreneurial experience providing context for understanding exactly how remarkable it was to build such comprehensive business success while maintaining complete privacy about ownership structure and strategic planning throughout years of competitive market development. The hospitality industry's consolidation trends create significant opportunities for operators who understand both local market dynamics and national scalability requirements, I continued, providing industry analysis that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of market conditions, while also establishing my credibility as someone whose success resulted from sophisticated strategic thinking rather than favorable circumstances or inherited advantages. The business-level analysis I was providing helped guests understand that my achievements represented genuine expertise applied consistently over multiple years rather than luck or favorable timing, while also demonstrating that my success would likely continue growing rather than representing a singular achievement that might not be sustainable in competitive national markets. Amanda Wells had moved closer to the head table, her phone positioned to capture both my composed delivery and the various reactions from family members who were processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about success, achievement, and the visible signs that typically accompanied extraordinary business accomplishment in contemporary American society. The Forbes article will include details about our innovative approach to venue design and client service that have differentiated Pacific Event Holdings from traditional hospitality operators, I said, providing additional context about media coverage while also suggesting that my business methods had involved genuine innovation rather than simply effective execution of established industry practices. The innovation angle helped guests understand that my success involved creative thinking and original approaches, rather than conventional business development, while also establishing that national media coverage would provide comprehensive analysis of methods that had enabled such remarkable results in competitive market conditions that challenged most hospitality entrepreneurs. I want to address one final point about family relationships and business operations, I said, preparing to conclude this portion of my response while acknowledging the emotional complexity that had characterized the evening's revelations. Maintaining privacy about Pacific Event Holdings wasn't motivated by shame or insecurity about family connections, but rather represented strategic decision-making about protecting both commercial interests and personal relationships from complications that often arise when business success intersects with family dynamics. The explanation of my motivation for maintaining secrecy helped family members understand that their exclusion from knowledge about my business activities hadn't been personal rejection, but rather represented professional decision-making designed to protect relationships, while also ensuring that commercial operations could develop without the complications that sometimes accompanied family involvement in entrepreneurial ventures. The Hamilton family members were beginning to exchange glances that reflected recognition of the comprehensive nature of my strategic thinking, their expressions suggesting appreciation for the discipline required to maintain such elaborate privacy, while also building business relationships throughout Portland's interconnected professional community, where discretion and confidentiality represented valuable competitive advantages. Tonight marks the end of Pacific Event Holdings' anonymous phase and the beginning of national expansion under public ownership structure, I said, establishing that the evening represented a significant transition point rather than simply a family revelation. The next chapter will involve different challenges and opportunities, but I'm confident that the foundation we've built over the past 5 years provides excellent preparation for success at larger scales. The forward-looking perspective helped guests understand that tonight's revelation represented strategic positioning for future growth rather than the culmination of my business ambitions, while also suggesting that my influence and wealth would likely continue expanding in ways that would establish me as a significant figure in national hospitality markets rather than simply a regional success story. I want to thank everyone for their attention during what I recognize has been an unusual interruption to Victoria and Marcus's wedding celebration, I said, preparing to conclude my remarks while acknowledging that family celebrations shouldn't be overshadowed by business revelations, regardless of their dramatic nature or strategic importance for managing public disclosure of previously private information. The gracious acknowledgement of the evening's celebratory purpose, while maintaining authority over the narrative, demonstrated leadership qualities that would serve me well during national expansion, while also showing respect for family relationships, despite the complex dynamics that had characterized years of maintaining strategic deception about business activities and financial circumstances. Part 12: Private Confrontation. The formal portion of the evening's revelations concluded as guests began processing the extraordinary information they'd received, their conversations creating a buzz of excitement and reassessment throughout Riverside Manor's ballroom, while I prepared to navigate the personal conversations that would inevitably follow such dramatic disclosure of previously hidden business success. The photographer continued documenting reactions and interactions, understanding that these moments would become part of Portland's social history as well as family memory. Victoria stood slowly from her chair, her wedding dress rustling against the marble floor as she approached me with an odd expression that reflected a complex mixture of emotions ranging from shock and embarrassment to what appeared to be dawning recognition of the comprehensive nature of the misunderstanding that had characterized our relationship throughout my business development years. "Maya, can we talk privately?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the kind of vulnerability that had been completely absent during her confident speech about practical decision-making and family lessons. The transformation from authoritative older sister to someone seeking understanding and perhaps forgiveness was striking in its completeness and emotional authenticity. I nodded toward a quieter corner of the ballroom near the windows overlooking the Willamette River, where we could have a conversation without the attention of 300 guests who were still processing the implications of tonight's revelations. The venue's sophisticated design included several areas suitable for private discussions, a feature that had proven valuable during countless corporate events and family celebrations over the years. Marcus remained at the head table, his expression reflecting the kind of professional respect that one successful entrepreneur shows toward another, while also processing the personal implications of discovering that his wife's family dynamics were far more complex than he'd previously understood. His parents appeared to be engaged in urgent whispered discussions about the social and business implications of tonight's revelations. "I don't even know where to begin," Victoria said as we reached the relative privacy of the window area, her voice trembling slightly as she struggled to find words adequate for addressing the magnitude of her misunderstanding about my circumstances and achievements. "Maya, how long have you been planning this? How long have I been making a fool of myself talking about your struggles and failures?" The pain in her voice was genuine, reflecting not just embarrassment about public humiliation, but deeper recognition that her understanding of our family dynamics had been fundamentally flawed throughout the years. She'd been offering guidance and expressing concern about my unconventional career choices and apparent financial struggles. 5 years, I replied honestly, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had characterized my public response, while recognizing that this private conversation required different levels of emotional honesty and vulnerability. "Since the Christmas dinner when you suggested I was embarrassing the family with my coding hobby, and told me I needed to find real work that wouldn't reflect poorly on everyone else." The specific reference to that particular holiday gathering created a visible flinch, Victoria's expression reflecting recognition of the comment that had apparently motivated me to begin the elaborate deception that had characterized our relationship throughout my business development period. Her words had clearly carried more impact than she'd realized at the time. "I was trying to help," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly as she processed the realization that her well-intentioned advice had apparently driven me to conceal extraordinary success rather than seeking family support and celebration for achievements that exceeded anything our parents had ever imagined possible for either of their daughters. "I know you were," I replied, my tone conveying genuine understanding of her motivations, while also acknowledging the emotional complexity that had made family honesty seem impossible during years when maintaining privacy had been essential to business success. "But your help came with assumptions about what success should look like and judgments about unconventional approaches that made sharing my actual circumstances feel too risky." The explanation helped Victoria understand that my secrecy hadn't been motivated by rejection of family connection, but rather by recognition that her value system and expectations might not have provided the supportive environment I'd needed while building something unprecedented in our family's experience with entrepreneurship and business development. "Maya, I had no idea," Victoria whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she processed the comprehensive nature of the misunderstanding that had shaped our relationship throughout the most significant period of my professional development. "When you said you were freelancing in event planning, I thought you were struggling to make ends meet. I thought you needed guidance and support to find stability."
The genuine distress in her voice reflected recognition that her attempts to provide sisterly guidance had been based on completely inaccurate assumptions about my circumstances, while also acknowledging that her public speech had transformed private family concerns into painful humiliation that would require significant repair and rebuilding of trust between us. "I was building something extraordinary," I said gently, helping her understand that my apparent struggles had actually represented strategic preparation for business success that required patience, discipline, and exactly the kind of long-term thinking she'd been advocating through different methods. "Every day you thought I was failing, I was actually learning and growing and building towards something bigger than either of us had imagined possible." The reframing of my career development from failure to preparation helped Victoria understand that her observations about my activities had been accurate in detail but completely wrong in interpretation, while also demonstrating that the values she'd been promoting through criticism had actually been guiding my strategic thinking throughout the business development process. "The Honda, the apartment, the modest lifestyle," Victoria said, beginning to process the comprehensive nature of the deception I'd maintained throughout years of family interactions. "All of it was intentional, all of it was strategy rather than struggle. All of it," I confirmed, acknowledging the scope of misdirection while also helping her understand that even seemingly minor details had been carefully orchestrated to maintain privacy and competitive advantage during years when anonymity had been essential to business success. "Every conversation we've had about my career has been carefully managed to protect information that could have compromised commercial relationships and strategic planning." The admission of comprehensive deception created another wave of emotional impact, Victoria's expression reflecting recognition that our entire relationship during my most successful period had been built on elaborate fiction designed to protect business interests, while maintaining family connections that had become increasingly complicated by her assumptions and judgments. "I feel like such an idiot," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of profound embarrassment that accompanies recognition of major errors in judgment that have been maintained publicly over extended periods. "Standing up there tonight, lecturing you about success and practical decision-making while you owned the venue where I was celebrating my wedding." The specific irony of her speech's location and content was particularly painful, representing not just private misunderstanding but public humiliation that had been witnessed by 300 of Portland's most influential residents, who would remember this evening as a dramatic example of assumptions and reality colliding in spectacular fashion. "Victoria, you couldn't have known," I said, offering genuine compassion for her embarrassment, while also acknowledging that the elaborate nature of my deception had made accurate assessment of my circumstances virtually impossible for family members who weren't involved in business operations or strategic planning discussions. "But I should have asked more questions," Victoria replied, her voice reflecting recognition that her assumptions about my struggles had prevented her from seeking deeper understanding of my activities and motivations. "I should have been curious about what you were actually doing instead of just assuming I understood your situation based on surface appearances." The self-reflection demonstrated emotional growth and recognition of the communication patterns that had enabled such comprehensive misunderstanding to persist throughout years of family interactions, while also suggesting that future relationship dynamics would need to be rebuilt on foundations of genuine curiosity rather than assumptions about success and failure. I chose not to share information that would have made those questions easier to ask, I admitted, acknowledging my own role in creating circumstances where honest family communication had become impossible due to competing priorities between business confidentiality and relationship transparency. "Why?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying genuine confusion about my motivation for maintaining such elaborate secrecy rather than seeking family support and celebration for achievements that clearly deserved recognition and pride from people who loved me. "Because I needed to build something that was entirely mine," I replied, providing insight into the psychological factors that had made independence feel more important than family validation during years when proving myself had been essential to long-term confidence and business success. I needed to know that whatever I achieved was the result of my own capabilities rather than family connections or support systems that might have made the accomplishment feel less authentic. The explanation helped Victoria understand that my secrecy hadn't been rejection of family love but rather represented the kind of independence seeking that often motivated entrepreneurs to build success through personal effort rather than leveraging existing relationships and advantages that might have made achievement feel less meaningful or sustainable. "And now?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying hope that tonight's revelations might create opportunities for rebuilding our relationship on more honest foundations that acknowledged both my achievements and her genuine desire to be supportive rather than critical of unconventional approaches to success. "Now we start over," I said, extending the possibility of relationship repair while also acknowledging that rebuilding trust and communication would require different approaches from both of us moving forward. Now we figure out how to be sisters when we both understand what's actually happening in each other's lives rather than operating from assumptions and misunderstandings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.